Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Imani Rupert Gordon, and I'm the Executive Director for Affinity Community Services. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers, or they, them, and theirs. And Affinity is a social justice organization that works with the entire LGBTQ community with a particular emphasis on Black LGBTQ women. So today we are talking to an amazing guest, Stephanie Martinez, and I will introduce them in just a minute. But before, I'd just like to remind you all that this is a call-in show. So if you are interested in asking a question or you just want to hear your voice on television, go on, call in. We'd love to hear from you. And you will be greeted when you call in by Jovan, who is volunteering for us today. Jovan is a board member for Affinity, and we love and appreciate all the work that she does. So, I'd also like to introduce my guest for today. Sure. So, this is Stephanie Martinez. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Stephanie is a certified nurse midwife and is interested in how reproductive justice impacts communities disproportionately affected by negative health outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Nice light topic there.
Exactly. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, just to jump right in, when we met, it was years ago at this point, but I don't know if you remember, we were working with youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability, and you were the person that trained me when I got there.
That's crazy.
Yes. And you were my introduction to the LGBTQ community in Chicago, so I have a special place in my heart for you, so thank you so much.
As do I for you.
Thank you. But I know that you were doing amazing work before you were there, and you're doing, if it's possible, even more amazing work now. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about that. We know that some people want to know about resources, but other folks want to know how folks got to the position they got here. So could you explain your career experience and trajectory for us?
Sure. So I have a very non-linear career story. So I guess I'll just kind of start at the beginning, which honestly goes all the way back to my childhood. But I had a couple extended family members who passed away from complications related to HIV and AIDS. And then fast forward a few years to high school, for whatever reason, I strongly feel maybe there was some racism going on in there. But for whatever reason, I became the sexual, reproductive health expert at my high school. I have no idea why. I was this weird little queer kid, But everybody started asking me how to get to Planned Parenthood, and one thing led to another, and fast forward, I end up, working in all these different nonprofits starting in 1999. Most of them are related to youth work and bettering health outcomes. So it could be related from anything from domestic violence to incarceration to talking about consent, talking about sexuality, but all types of different youth venues, including the Broadway Youth Center where we met. So working with so many youth that were in all types of crisis and experiencing a lot of violence, I found myself just saying over and over and over again, well, I'm not a nurse, but blah, 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 blah. So I ended up deciding to go to nursing school, and in my first semester of nursing school, my brother's wife got pregnant. And they decided to have a home birth, and I guess years of being, kind of de-escalating crisis made me really, really good in crisis, and for whatever reason they wanted me there. And so seeing my nephew born in 2011 kind of changed my life, and so yeah, that's what led me to become a midwife, and I just got my master's this year. So it's official. I am a certified nurse midwife finally.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, so you're a midwife, and I also know that you're a doula as well, and sort of a lot of other things too. Could you explain the work that you do and why you think it's important?
Yeah, sure. So the work that I do right now is I catch babies in people's homes. So I work at the largest home birth group in Illinois. And to me, it's really important that people's birth plans be respected and honored as much as possible. So obviously they're hiring me to keep everybody safe. So if things are being done that maybe are not so safe, that's when it's my turn to intervene. But to me, it's just really important that all types of babies come into this world, with love and with respect and with dignity. And so that's what I really try to do. Aside from that, though, I think people think midwives and they think babies right away, but we're actually advanced practice nurses who like have a full scope of healthcare that we can provide as it relates to reproductive health. So there's also lots of PAPs and birth control, and sometimes I could probably use a little bit more education in like sexual counseling because there's some stuff that comes up there too. Yeah, but those are some of the things that midwives do and what I'm doing now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, can you explain what it means to be a birth worker, and what are some of the differences between birth workers? There are a lot of things to know.
Yeah, and it's really confusing. I get asked this a lot. So first off, the difference between a doula and a midwife. The quick and dirty is that a doula is a weekend training, and a midwife is minimum a master's degree when you're already a registered nurse before you started your school.
Wow.
And so there's also a push actually in the state for it to be a doctoral degree, which I'm not doing anytime soon. So there's doulas, and you know, this is basically just somebody who accompanies you throughout your labor, you and your partner and whoever else you want present there. Back in the day, this was people's mamas, aunties, sisters, communities, you know, and now it's something that you can get hired for. So, interestingly enough, doula is actually a Greek word for slave. So I think that kind of shows the nature of like the original purpose of the work.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
so there's a doula. I mentioned I'm a nurse. I'm also a lactation consultant. And then there's a midwife, which I talked about as a whole bunch of school. So basically, I think it's important to talk about the history of birth work in this country and why, you know, birth workers are being used as like a term again. So a lot of folks of color just kind of started, folks of color who work in birth work started reclaiming that term because, like I mentioned before, you know, in the United States especially, there's a long history of Black granny midwives, of indigenous midwives, of immigrant midwives within their own communities who caught the babies and healed the wounds and, you know, nursed people back to health. And there wasn't a lot of formal education involved. You usually got trained by somebody else, often somebody else in your family, usually a mama or auntie or grandma. And with the growth of the OB field, the career really started becoming criminalized if you were a woman of color especially. And then they started requiring a whole bunch of school in order to get these letters behind your name. So then that brings up a bunch of different questions of privilege and who has access to education. And the sad reality is that a lot of people of color have been shut out of birth work. So this is why we don't all go by the certified nurse midwife role. There are folks that I know who I consider midwives, but haven't finished high school, you know. So that's why there's some variation in term, but birth workers is kind of like an umbrella term for everybody.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that
Of course.
clarification. Yeah. So, let's talk about home birth. And why do you think LGBTQ families should consider home births?
Yeah, I strongly feel that LGBTQ families should consider home birth for a bunch of reasons. So there's a study that I read a couple years ago that was saying that if you spend 24 hours in a hospital, the average amount of times that your door will be knocked on within that 24-hour period is 48 times.
Oh my goodness.
So we're talking 48 different souls coming into your room. And there's the potential to be misgendered, to be mistreated, not to mention germs. We're not even going to get into all that, you know. So there's that, you know, and I think because I'm with a smaller group, there's not all these workers. It's really just us. It's me and a nurse that's in somebody's home when they're in labor, you know. There's less opportunities for you to be disrespected or, you know, misgendered. Additionally, I think actually we know that, you know, LGBTQ communities are disproportionately impacted by violence, by trauma, and by like mental health issues, things like anxiety and depression. So I've noticed a really strong trend in people approaching home birth because they like the idea of that control, of that safety of being in their own home. So because I think queer communities are disproportionately impacted by anxiety, I actually think home birth is a pretty viable option for folks to get over some of that and to have some not only more control, more say in their birthing experience, but also, just there's less of a possibility for somebody to not be trauma informed that's working with you, I think the two midwives that I work with were all pretty trauma informed. The nurses were all pretty strong as well. And you can't say that for a lot of hospital staff,
Gotcha.
And then, side note, and this kind of goes for everybody regardless of your sexuality, but you should think about home birth because there's less germs.
So you said that.
Yeah.
So, I guess I'm under the impression that hospitals are pretty germ-free.
They're really not. Like, that's where the scary stuff is. That I shouldn't creep people out with gross stuff, but the reality is you're exposing your baby to a lot less germs by giving birth to them at home. This is under the assumption that you're healthy and you're a low risk patient, and it's just one baby. It's not octuplets or anything like that.
Gotcha.
So
right.
But yeah, if you're a germaphobe, I strongly recommend home birth.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that.
Anytime.
This is so informative. So I wanted to ask you, and this is actually, I think, kind of the main question I wanted to ask you. So very often, the LGBTQ community is left out of conversations around reproductive justice. And I'm wondering, that seems pretty ridiculous. And I'm wondering, why do you think reproductive justice, reproductive rights, reproductive health, why do you think that is an LGBTQ issue?
Well, the term itself of reproductive justice was coined in the 90s by an organization called Sister Song that's based out of Atlanta. They're really incredible. And this amazing woman named Loretta Ross, who I actually got to meet back in the day. But anyway, it was kind of developed as a response to, a lot of white women feminists who were maybe not as inclusive as they could have been when they were talking about issues regarding abortion specifically. So reproductive justice started off with the idea of being more inclusive of women of color and also of LGBTQ folks in our experiences. So there are things that we've experienced that aren't as common in white communities, things like sterilization abuse, things like getting our kids taken by DCFS, even just access to birth control, things like that. We don't always have what we need. These are pretty specific issues to our communities. But when the way that, reproductive justice is defined, it's basically the right to parent, the right to not parent, or the right to parent or the right to parent in a safe and healthy environment. Okay? So when you think about it with just those three bare bones, rules of what reproductive justice are, they totally are inclusive of queer folks, and of trans folks, because some of us maybe want a parent now. Maybe some of us, it's an absolutely horrifying thought, and we've all had varying levels of access to be able to get what we need, right? So additionally, when we talk about being able to parent in a safe and healthy environment, we're talking about, much more integrated things. So I start thinking about environmental justice. I start thinking about food justice. I start thinking about the prison industrial complex and all these different ways that our babies could potentially be harmed by our environments, especially in Chicago, lack of schooling is a big thing that comes to mind, So when we think about folks that are the most impacted by these issues, it's queer and trans folks of color, So even though I think the fact that reproductive justice starts with reproductive is kind of a turnoff for a lot of queer folks, just to be perfectly frank with you. Not all of us are thinking about babies or procreating or any of that stuff. But I think a lot of us also are maybe not so familiar with what it is, and don't recognize that we're very much a part of that fight. It's all intersectional, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Of course.
sharing. I appreciate that. So, you were talking a bit about parenting. And I'm wondering, what about people that know that parenting isn't for them? Where do you think they fit in this discussion?
Yeah, so I think it's important to maybe have a pause to maybe talk about consent, because, I think when we're talking about the right to parent or not parent, there's kind of this assumption that everybody has the privilege to be able to consent to whatever sex is happening with their body, you know. So if somebody is,
That's a great point.
the reality, especially something that we saw a lot at Broadway Youth Center, was that many queer and trans youth have to engage in sex trade and sex work for survival, you know. So whatever they want coming out of their bodies after something that went into it, like midwives can definitely support them in getting their needs met, you know. So I think that's one thing. The other part of that is that if you're not having any type of sex that can make a baby, but you do have a cervix, the reality is that cervix can get cancer, and that cancer is very preventable with a pap smear. And that's something that midwives provide, and can often do it in a more trauma-informed, more sensitive, less unpleasant way than maybe some of us have experienced it in the past. Same thing goes for breast exams. These are, queer and trans folks have really high rates of breast cancer and of cervical cancer. And I think a big reason for it is because we get fed up with being misgendered or being asked weird questions when we show up for these preventative services, or we just flat out are getting disrespected when we're trying to access these services. So midwives, not all midwives, but the good ones that are trans and queer competent, can hopefully make this important part of healthcare just another hoop to jump through rather than something that's torturous.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you kind of talked about this, but I wonder if you can go into a little bit more detail. Why do you think it's imperative that healthcare providers are LGBT competent? What have you seen that's just made your skin crawl?
Oh my God.
And what do you think folks could do to just be more competent?
Yeah.
Or providers in particular?
Yeah. So I mean, queer and trans folks, again, are the most disproportionately impacted by poor health outcomes. And so much of it has to do with just basic disrespect, not only on part of the provider, but the entire staff at clinic or healthcare settings, So I have heard some really horrifying conversations from providers or just disrespectful comments or heard all types of horror stories from people when they were accessing healthcare. Before I became a provider, I was doing a lot of work as a case manager, and I literally got to sit in a bunch of people's appointments and was really horrified at how folks were being spoken to, So I can at least speak for midwives, kind of, sort of, but I have to say that since I came into this field, I feel like the American College of Nurse Midwives, which is like the kind of sort of governing board or whatever, they're really trying to improve access to education for providers so that we can be trans competent, so we can know some basics about hormones,
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we have a long way to go, but I've been impressed with, in the short amount of time that I've been involved, and I don't say that lately. It's kind of hard to impress me, So I do hope that this is a trend in healthcare where folks are really trying to provide as much education as possible so that providers and healthcare workers, and receptionists and phlebotomists and nurses and nurses' aides and everybody in the healthcare spectrum know the basics of sexuality and gender identity, and know to not assume anything and to just kind of be humble, which is really in direct opposition to what a lot of people learn in med school, but I think it's an important skill to have if you want to be trans competent and queer competent. So yeah.
Thank you. So, switching gears just a little bit, I'm wondering, what is the coolest thing that you think that you've been able to do, or the thing that you've been most proud of as a birth worker?
So seeing babies born is always amazing, regardless of the venue or people or whatever. It's just, it's a miracle, I think something, a couple different folks that have special places in my heart are folks that I worked with through BYC, and also folks, youth that were involved in DCFS and got pregnant, and I got to be their doula. And, it was just, the statistics, or I don't know if you know the statistics for Black and Latino youth in the system that are teen parents, but they're pretty bad, and it was really amazing to see these youth not give birth prematurely, have the fathers present, try breastfeeding immediately, try skin to skin immediately, you know, lots of talk, lots of unlearning about spoiling the baby, you know, and just like literally seeing intergenerational cycles of violence and trauma get broken through their experience giving birth, you know.
Yeah.
It was super powerful and really beautiful to watch. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So, I want you to maybe share the last word. What, if you want us to know anything at all? I mean, can you think of it, if anything, it could be something that has been difficult that you'd like to see rectified, or just something we haven't been able to talk about just yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's been more and more talk about maternal and child health outcomes, specifically for Black women in this country, and how absolutely appalling they are, especially considering how wealthy this country is. I really admire, you know, Michelle Obama and Beyonce and, you know, Serena, not just for who they are, obviously, but also for being open about their birth stories and, like, the struggles that they had. They're incredible women with all the privilege in the world, and yet still face these like life-threatening challenges and scares, you know. So, I guess I just want to mention that we need to work harder for Black women. We need to work harder for Black families in this country. This is not acceptable. We can do better than this. And I think the other thing that I would say to everybody is, if you don't like your provider, you can change. You can switch the provider. If you don't like your nurse, you can ask for another nurse. You have the right to request somebody else. You have the right to health care where you're being treated respectfully, and where you're, that's the quick and dirty of it. Like, you know, you don't need to settle just because you have public aid. You don't need to settle because you don't have documents. Everybody deserves quality health care. This is a human right. So.
That's amazing. Stephanie, you are an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Oh, of course. Likewise. So if people want to find out more about what you're doing, ask questions, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I guess I'm on Instagram. You can get a hold of me at Parterx, which is Parterx. Partera is the Spanish word for midwife. X is gender neutral, because that's me.
There we go.
I also have a kind of out-of-date blog that's called Vida Doula Services. It's just a WordPress, but you can find me over there too.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks, Affinity, for everything you do.
Oh, thank you. And thanks so much for joining us again. So we are here the fourth Friday of the month. Today we're here the fifth Friday because last week was a holiday. But we will be here next, I want to say next. We might not, because I think there's a holiday around that too. But check our website and we'll let you know. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, tonight's date night. If you want to impress someone, momentarily means both in a minute and for a minute. Have a wonderful night.